Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Build the Era event. My name is Laura DeVoe, and I'm a member of the Build the Era board. And I'm located here in Newton, Massachusetts. It's a suburb of Boston. For those of you who are new or need further introduction to what Build the Era is an education and advocacy organization focused on transportation and infrastructure as it relates to the Department of Transportation. We are volunteer founded and volunteer powered by supporters, volunteers, and staffers from the Pete Buttigieg 2020 presidential campaign, as well as folks who found their way to Pete and the DOT. Build the Era's purpose is to connect citizens from across America to the Department of Transportation by educating and informing the public as to what the DOT does and does not do and why it matters. Educating and informing the public to the role that infrastructure plays in America's quality of life, providing training and guidance on how to engage with local and federal elected officials on matters related to DOT initiatives, provide training and guidance on how to advocate for causes using relational organizing as a primary tool, and create measurable effectiveness and change. Our mission is as follows. Build the Era is committed to making the Department of Transportation's role in American movement understood by citizens and activating them to engage for smart and equitable investments by the Department of Transportation and for better multimodal planning in their communities. I'd like to thank you for being here and helping us to contribute to the attainment of our mission, vision, and values. For information on how to connect with Build the Era, please go to our website at buildtheera.com. There you will find information on our various social media platforms, as well as links to our resources and upcoming events. Of particular interest to you might be our YouTube page, which you can, as the kids say today, smash that follow button to keep up with our library of videos. Today's event is being recorded and we will be posting it so you can see all of it in the future. And also you can share it with friends who you think would benefit from this. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Kelly Buckland is a person with a disability who has been actively involved in disability issues since 1979. He served for over 20 years as the executive director of the Living Independence Network Corporation and the Idaho State Living Independent Living Council in Boise, Idaho. Kelly graduated from Boise State University with a BA in social work and Drake University with a master's in rehabilitation counseling. Kelly has been honored with numerous state and national awards, including the University of Idaho's President's Medallion, the Hewlett-Packard Distinguished Achievement in Human Rights Award, Outstanding Alumni for Boise State University, and Outstanding Alumni for Drake University. Kelly has testified before Congress numerous times on issues such as universal health care, fair housing, appropriations for centers for independent living, Olmstead, and COVID-19. Additionally, Kelly has a long history with the National Council on Independent Living, otherwise known as NCIL. He has served on numerous NCIL legislative and advocacy subcommittees and other standing NCIL committees. The NCIL governing board since 1998, as NCIL vice president from 2001 to 2005, and as NCIL president from 2005 to 2009, and executive director from 2009 to July of 2021. Following the formal part of today's program, there'll be time for question and answer. So please put your questions in the chat and Bill will keep an eye on that. And now I will share my screen so we can show you I'm going to show you the wonderful slide deck from Kelly. So welcome, Kelly, and it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And it's great to have you. I had a wonderful time getting to know Kelly. We had a nice prep meeting And I am looking forward to having everybody benefit from Kelly as well. So Kelly, you just tell me when you want me to advance the slide. I have the slide deck, and we're going to get started.
All right. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Well, let me just say first, for everybody's benefit, I am the Disability Policy Advisor in the Office of the Secretary, and we were just talking about Secretary Pete and him being my boss. So, next slide now, Laura, if you would, please.
And everyone, Kelly says he's a great boss, which we're not surprised.
He is a great boss. Very proud to work for him. So I just presented this slideshow to the Disability Stakeholder Roundtable on last Monday. And so you are, and then I presented this also to the Access Board yesterday. And so you guys are the third ones to see it. And these are not adopted by the department yet. They're still proposed priorities. So any input you have will be helpful. I got input from the Stakeholder Roundtable. We had about 30 people from 25 different organizations. And the Access Board, you all know who they are. If not, the Access Board really is a independent government body that does most of the standard setting under the ADA and a number of other disability related topics, and they do research and standard setting on those, which then are either adopted by DOT or by DOJ. And I didn't really realize how much we at the Department of Transportation worked with the Access Board until I got here, and it's becoming apparent real quickly how much we have to do with them. We work with them on so many different issues, which I'll talk about some of those. But anyway, so this is really, you guys are the third ones to see the slideshow. So I start off with giving the people some statistics because I think these are kind of interesting and sort of set the tone. So there's an estimated 25.5 million Americans who experience a travel limiting disability that makes it difficult to participate in activities of daily living. So I think most people agree that there's around 60 million people with disabilities. And so to be at 25.5 affecting travel, that's almost half of the population of people with disabilities that experience a travel-related disability. And then the other one I point out is really the employment statistics. And the reason for that is that there's about 70% of the population of people with disabilities do not even participate in the job market. And of those 30% that do, there's about double the unemployment rate amongst people with disabilities as their counterparts without disabilities. And if you add into that being a woman or a woman of color, the amount of unemployment just increases exponentially based upon those factors. So it's very hard to be employed if you're a woman of color with a disability. Next slide, please, Laura. So there are some specific projects that the infrastructure bill law, the bipartisan infrastructure law, provide funding for disability related projects. So it dedicates $39 billion to modernize transit and improve accessibility for aging adults and people with disabilities. And $1.75 billion of that is specifically targeted toward the All Stations Accessibility Program, which Tammy Duckworth fought to get in there. And that will make rail stations like Amtrak stations more accessible to all users. The bill also requires that there's a person with disability, talking about Amtrak, be included on the Amtrak Board of Directors. That appointment has just been nominated. 250 million in transit-related grants that specifically enhance the mobility of aging adults and people with disabilities. It requires DOT to identify and promote methods to addressing barriers to employment in transportation and transportation infrastructure construction industries. As a matter of fact, we're having a conversation tomorrow, DOT is, with DOL and ODEP about specifically that and how to achieve it. And then it dedicates $5 billion toward improving airport terminals with preference given to projects that expand accessibility and ADA compliance. But what I like to point out to people, I mean, all of these projects are great, and I'm really glad that they're in the bill. But I think if we pay attention too much to that, we miss the bigger picture, which is like well over $600 billion being dedicated toward infrastructure building activities. So if we do all of that, well over $600 billion in building and do it according to the ADA 504 and the Air Carrier Access Act, we can have a much bigger impact on the entire built environment. And we could make really a once in a generation difference in accessibility toward people with disabilities if we build all of those projects according to those requirements. So it's good that those other projects are in here, but I think we need to keep our eye on the bigger picture as well. So next slide, Laura. So over the past few months, we've been working on identifying the policy priorities for people with disabilities to guide the department's work over the next 3 years. And it really comes down to these 4 pillars. So the first one is enable safe and accessible air travel. And the reason that that's number 1 is because air travel for people who specifically use wheelchairs, but it's also true for other people with disabilities, has become so dangerous and so unsafe that a lot of people with disabilities have simply just stopped flying on airplanes. And that stands true for me. I'm going to fly again on Monday, but this will be my first trip in a while because it really is a dangerous undertaking right now, especially since they took away the mask mandate. Like you can because there's no testing, there's no vaccination requirement, and there's no mask requirement. You can literally be sitting between 2 people in the back of an airplane who actively have COVID and are not wearing masks, and you're sitting shoulder to shoulder with them. But there's a lot of other reasons too. I mean, PVA has done a survey that shows that like 20% of the people who use wheelchairs that are being transferred from their chair to the aisle chair and then to the airplane seat are actually being dropped. And a lot of people have come close to dying, and in fact, some people have died as a result of injuries that they received.
That was actually, I apologize for interrupting, Kelly, but something when you and I were talking yesterday, when I asked you about the chairs and about the wheelchairs being damaged, when you said to me that people actually were dropped, it took my breath away. And I'm glad you've brought it up again. And obviously this is going to be something people may have a follow-up question about, but I want to really accentuate that we're not talking about an inanimate object that, while it is an extension of people's way of getting around, and it is their way of getting around, people physically have been dropped.
Yeah, people physically been injured. They've been they are currently being hospitalized just by trying to get on an airplane. I mean, that's how dangerous it's become. The second pillar is enabling multimodal accessibility of public transportation facilities, vehicles, and rights of way. And this one is specifically highlighted because, believe it or not, there have been no accessibility standards in place around much of the public rights of way. There have been some following of standards, but there's not been a set of standards that have been mandated. Those should be published this summer. The final standards should be published this summer by the Access Board, and then hopefully adopted by DOJ and DOT, which we've both been having input into those. But they come along at a really good time when we're spending all of these billions and billions of dollars on infrastructure. So this is really one of those things that is just really timely given where we are. The third pillar is enabling access to good paying jobs and business opportunities for people with disabilities. And the reason for this one, again, is infrastructure. And we are creating so many jobs with the infrastructure funds that really people with disabilities, given the unemployment rates that I talked about earlier, really should have access to some of those jobs that are being created. And then the last one is to enable accessibility of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. And the reason for this one is, so public transit vehicles that are electric or autonomous are going to have to be accessible because the law requires that. But the private market selling individual cars or ones that aren't big enough for public transit are the ones that we're concerned about, because you can't just simply modify them the way that we currently do with gas-powered vehicles. So we want to make sure that people with disabilities are not left out of the movement around electrification of vehicles and the automation of vehicles, and that they have access to that technology as well. And then there's some department-wide stuff that we're going to be working on anyway, but we want to call these out specifically. One is reinvigorate the programmatic enforcement of the ADA, Section 504, the Rehab Act, and the Air Carrier Access Act. In fact, the statement that was released by Secretary Pete really calls for energetic and enthusiastic enforcement of those laws, which I really like the way he puts it. And then advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the DOT workforce. Of course, this is based upon the executive order by the president, and something that people with disabilities have been looking for, especially people with disabilities of color. So we're looking to try to really advance that within the department's workforce. And then I heard this at the Disability Stakeholder Roundtable, and we were planning on addressing this anyway, but there's really a lot of data gaps around people with disabilities and services provided within the Department of Transportation's sphere, if you will. So like air travel, talking about that, there's really very little, if any, statistics gathered around people and their air travel experiences. I mean, they started collecting, I think it was 2018, they started collecting information on the number of devices like wheelchairs and stuff that are damaged by the airlines, which actually that's turning out to be like 6 a day or something like that. But it's in the tens of thousands of devices. But that's really all we're really gathering data on right now. We don't know how many travelers there are with disabilities, or we don't know how many people with disabilities don't travel because of their disability and the way that it's treated. So anyway, a lot of that kind of data we need to, and then wayfinding data as well. And then ensuring that all DOT meetings are fully accessible to people with disabilities, as well as resources like the website. And really want to make sure that any public meetings that are held by DOT, that there are interpreters in CART at every one of them. Currently, right now, they're provided when requested, but you have to request them 5 days in advance. And we just want to make sure they're always there. So if somebody makes a decision that day or the day before that they want to attend a meeting that DOT is hosting, they can do that. With that, if you could advance the slides. So this will give you a little bit more information about each pillar. So the Access Board commissioned a study by the Transportation Research Board that looked into people with disabilities who use wheelchairs being able to stay in their own personal wheelchairs on aircraft and look at the feasibility of that. So the Transportation Research Board did that study, lasted about a year. I was one of the people who testified at it before I was at the Department of Transportation. They issued their report last fall, and their report said, of course, it's feasible, but there's further research that needs to be done, especially around like the crash testing of wheelchairs and that kind of stuff, and securement systems and so on. So, and they recommend that the Department of Transportation be the ones to take that up, and we are going to do that. We're going to start that research soon so that we can develop a pathway for getting from where we are today to people actually being able to fly on airplanes in their own personal wheelchairs, just like they do in every other type of transportation. Like the only place you're required to give up your mobility device when you get on is an airplane. In buses, you stay in your own chair. In trains, you stay in your own chair. Like in boats, you stay in your own chair. It's only in airplanes that you have to give up your mobility device. So we're going to try to make it on equal footing with other forms of transportation. And then we want to decrease the number of passengers with disabilities whose wheelchairs are damaged, which we just talked about, and people who are injured during the transfers to and from aircraft, which we also just talked about. So there will be rulemaking proposed that will require safe accommodations for air travelers, both in transferring, and then there'll be a requirement that training occur to the personnel who do that kind of stuff, hands-on training at least twice a year. And then we have a rule out right now where passengers in their wheelchairs, it would make the lavatories on single aisle aircraft accessible. That is still out for comment. If you haven't commented, I really highly encourage you to do that. One of the provisions is it gives airlines 20 years before they have to do it. Like I'll be dead by then. So, you know, we're specifically looking for input into that. Like, can we do this quicker? And of course, I believe we can do it quicker than 20 years. So that kind of comments would be great. And then just really decreasing the frequency of incidents where people have their civil rights violated when they're trying to travel by air. And so this gives you a little bit better understanding about what we're actually proposing to do that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we will be doing.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. Is there's a Bill of Rights that has been established for air travelers with disabilities, and we're hoping to have that actually out there so that people can be educated about what their rights are, and posted up around July. So a month and a half from now. I specifically think this would be great if we could do it right around the anniversary of the ADA. But now you can go to the next slide, Laura. So this is what, again, I talked about this earlier, but basically because of all the work going on in the infrastructure and the rules being issued by the Access Board around public rights of way, want to make sure that people with disabilities can safely access roadways, sidewalks, and streets crossing and reduce the number of pedestrian fatalities. And that, again, is also connected, as people pointed out to me, connected to like the Safe Streets Initiative as well, and the Complete Streets Initiative. And then there's the Justice 40 initiative within the Department of Transportation. All of this sort of fits together. So we're going to try to like make sure that, all of that stuff is integrated, but this fits into all of that. So that, like I mentioned, the Access Board is going to be publishing those rules around the accessibility standards for the pedestrian facilities and the public rights of way this coming summer. And we're looking to, because of all the infrastructure money that we're providing, we're looking to require state Department of Transportations, because they'll be the recipients of a lot of that, to complete their ADA transition plans. I mean, believe it or not, 30 years later, we have several states where their DOTs have not even completed the plans, let alone completed the activities in the plan. So this would help us really eliminate a lot of the legacy infrastructure that's still inaccessible. And there's kind of a term we've been using within the department, like not a dollar spent on inaccessible infrastructure. We will be proposing rulemaking around equitable access to transit facilities too, and this includes rail stations, and that kind of connects into the All Stations Accessibility Program. And then really enforcing ADA compliance in existing improvements in Amtrak. I went up to Philadelphia, and I know Carol Tyson's on the call, and Carol and I were both in Philly looking at a soft mock-up of the train sets that are going to be built by Siemens for Amtrak, and providing input into the accessibility of those train sets. I'm leaving next week to go out to Sacramento to the Siemens factory, where I'll also have a chance to give input into the train sets that are being built for Amtrak. And then I'm going to come back from there on the train, on the Superliner, to look at like the long haul train and how accessible it is, and how much, and what kind of improvements really need to be made toward the long haul trains. We've looked at the regional trains and looked at the Scylla, but really haven't looked at the Superliner. And apparently those trains are going to be up for replacement in a couple of years, again, under the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we have an opportunity to make all of those train sets much more accessible as well. So Laura, next slide. So this is the enabling access to good paying jobs and business opportunities. And again, we're meeting with DOL and ODEP, which is the Office on Disability Employment Policy, to talk about this. But there is an opportunity for us right now to also have an impact on the disadvantaged business enterprise. That doesn't specifically call out people with disabilities, but there's a place in there where you can make businesses owned by people with disabilities fit. I mean, obviously, if they're a member of another minority, like if they're a person of color who has a disability, or they're a woman with a disability, they're already eligible for the disadvantaged business enterprise, but we want to make there room for all people with disabilities who are business owners to have an opportunity to take advantage of this, because a significant amount of the infrastructure money is going to be targeted toward that funding, going toward the disadvantaged business enterprises. So want to make sure people with disabilities are included in that. And then we want to make sure that all of the federal contractors are following 503, which requires Section 503 of the Rehab Act, which requires that they hire 7% of their workforce be people with disabilities. So with that, you can go to the next slide. And I saw earlier somebody mentioned that they were specifically interested in the electric and automated vehicles. So what we're really trying to propose here is that the universal design approach be taken with both electric vehicles and automated vehicles, and that there be standards developed that make sure that those doors are accessible to people with disabilities. The authority for this is still up in the air, probably will require some legislation. And we also think that there probably needs to be some incentives in there to get industry to be more attracted and be more interested in this. And right now, the Department of Transportation does have the inclusive design challenge going on. We're in the final phases of that. We should be able to announce the winners of that in July, hopefully around around the ADA anniversary. The first prize is $1 million, so it's not a small chunk of change. And these guys have already done quite a bit of work around making sure that automated vehicles are that they're offering technologies that will make them more accessible to people with disabilities. And with that, I think that's my last slide, and we can have discussion. People can ask questions. I'm happy to try to answer them.
Great. Well, I thank you for sharing all of that. I know that's a lot of information, but I feel like we've gotten a look underneath the hood, so to speak. And how you like that little transportation pun? Okay, a really bad one, but hey, I'm gonna go with it. So I have a few questions for you, and then I'm gonna then ask Bill to kind of pull some of them from the chat for us. This is really an impressive set of priorities. And I think that one of the things that part of our mission here at Build the Era is really about helping our members become better transportation advocates. And I'm wondering from you, Kelly, is how can individuals who are members of Build the Era be helpful at a local level in helping meet these priorities?
That's a great question. And it's really an important one, and can play a really significant role. I mean, we can propose these priorities at DOT at the policy level and even adopt them and enforce them, right? But where really the rubber hits the road, another transportation pun, right? Bad one, but is going to be at the local level. So that is where we really need people to be active. There's a requirement in most of these grants that the recipients of the funding, especially like the state departments of transportation, they're going to be required to do public engagement around not only the applications that they put in for funding are going to require that they have done public engagement, but then the projects that they work on with that funding are going to require that they are publicly engaging people on a local level. And that's where people should get really involved. And if you haven't heard from your Department of Transportation or your local transportation provider, you should be getting in touch with them now and letting them know that when they apply for infrastructure funds, you are one of the people that you would like to be involved in their public engagement activities. And then just for people to become advocates and watchdogs and local sort of eyes on what's happening, make sure that people are making their transportation services accessible and that they're reaching out to underserved populations. Laura, you and I, when we had our talk earlier yesterday,
Yep.
I talked about that there's like 40% of these funds are going to be directed toward underserved populations because there's been systemic discrimination involved in a lot of the transportation funding that's been done in the past. And Bill really requires and offers a great opportunity to direct some of that funding into underserved communities where they haven't had access to a lot of this infrastructure monies before. So,
right. And I think as a follow-up to that, and this actually ties into a lot of the people on this call who may be quite in tune with Secretary's public speaking schedule. Last week, he was at the University of Chicago, and he talked about how, I think it was his last point, was actually there's a lot of publicity and a lot of light being shown on what my department's doing, but people can really take action in their community. And this is exactly what he's talking about, is that we can take action in our communities and make sure that our state DOTs are getting the work done. I'm sad to hear that there are state DOTs that haven't gotten their homework done 30 years late in terms of having a plan, but you and I can talk offline and give me the list and we'll be angry at those folks. But the follow-up question to this, though, is I'm looking at this through the lens of I'm a taxpayer. I live in a city. I can, talk to the zoning board. I can talk to my state DOT. My question about airlines and about the airline stuff, how can we be effective advocates in the air when we don't live in the air?
Well, that's a good question. I think if you look at the rulemaking that the department's going to be doing, having input into that would be helpful and supporting it, because believe me, we're going to get significant pushback from airlines. They don't want to do anything that costs them $1 or inconveniences them at all. So they'll be pushed back around rules that even require safety, right? So even though they say safety is their first concern, when it comes to people with disabilities, it's not. And so having your support in that rulemaking process would really be helpful.
Okay. So what we'll do, and I'll commit to this, and it's on tape. So because I'm 105, it's on tape. We will make sure that we are getting information on when there's public times for public comment, and for us to be able to give a good input. And people should check their newsletter. That will be a great place for us to be able to put information in our weekly newsletter about, hey, they're looking for public comment around this, this, and this. This is a good time for us to speak up, especially as it relates to some of these accessibility issues. Because I agree.
Right now is the accessible laboratories on single aisle aircraft is out there right now. So please provide comment, and say it needs to be done sooner rather than later.
We'll get that link and we'll get the information out to folks. I have one more question, because I know we're going to come up on time, and I don't want us to just have my questions. I want to make sure we get some from the community here. But when you're talking about agencies that are doing good work, one of the agencies I asked you yesterday about who's actually doing good work. We just kind of beat up on the airline industry a bit because they're not doing great work in terms of that. Who's doing good work?
I actually have to praise the buses. I mean, you can go anywhere in this country that has a fixed route system, and their buses are going to be accessible. And I've traveled quite a bit in the country, and all I've met is super helpful drivers too. I mean, I'm sure there are less than helpful ones out there, but for the most part, I've met drivers that are just really helpful. And so I praise the bus system. I like the bus system. I think they're really good. And somebody's just put in there the accessibility on buses in Seattle that I couldn't put it any better. Seattle's got one of the most accessible transit systems in the world. So yeah, the bus system really deserves a lot of praise.
Great. I'm going to start pulling stuff up from the chat, and I'm going to start with one from Nicole, and then Bill, if there's any additional ones that you think I should pull, please let me know. This one's from Nicole. I'm wondering what, if anything, USDOT can do about the fact that ambulances cannot carry power wheelchairs. Some won't even take a manual wheelchair if it can't collapse. People are taking public transportation in the middle of medical emergencies to get to the hospital. Others are forced to abandon their wheelchair in public places when they suddenly need an ambulance. I know ambulances are private, but I'm hoping USDOT can do something about this unacceptable situation, which has impacted me personally multiple times.
Wow. I mean, I've never even thought of that. That's a great comment. I will definitely look into what we can do. I know once I flew into Salt Lake, I was actually headed to Boise from DC, and the plane was late, so they didn't hold the plane to Boise for me, and they said not to worry, we'll get you a hotel room. And this sort of, well, they didn't have any accessible transportation to the hotel, and they worked on it for hours. I sat in the airport while they were trying to find accessible transport. So at like 2 o'clock in the morning, my quote unquote accessible transportation showed up, and it's an ambulance. Like, and ambulances are not accessible. So it's kind of like, I mean, they did have to lift my power chair up into the ambulance with me, but and I couldn't believe the amount of money they spent. Like, it was $500, and this was some time ago. It's $500 for the ambulance just to show up, and then it was like $25 a mile. And if you've ever been to Salt Lake, you know how far the airport is from Salt Lake. I mean, it's quite a drive. And then $500 the next morning for them to show up, and then $25 a month. I mean, it cost them like a lot of money to get an ambulance, but it still wasn't accessible. So that's really an important point. I will look into that more. I think that's a great thought. So,
well, I appreciate that. And Nicole is absolutely, I know Nicole through our Pete verse, and Nicole is never one to hold back on a comment. And so she will make sure to keep us informed. And Kelly, I'll make sure that anything you have, we can get to her. And so, and we'll post it out in a future newsletter with any updates. Bill, anything in particular?
Yeah, I would like to call on Carol Tyson, who is with us. Carol, if you don't mind, if you can at least speak up. And oh, there's Carol. Hi. First of all, thank you for joining us today. And we're going to continue a discussion with you in another session focused on the world that you advocate for. But what would you like to share with the group today, briefly?
Hi everybody, this is Carol. I'm with the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, but also I'm a huge fan of Kelly's, and I'm very grateful for his continued leadership and all of his efforts, and you're doing a really great job, Kelly, and we're all grateful, folks on the outside, so thank you. I put most of it in the chat, and I don't know if people can see it. So we have, but I did forget one thing. People are asking about air travel, and there's one other thing you can do. There's a bill called the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act and we need support. There's a petition, you can learn about it. It would help, in addition to all of the things that Kelly's working on at USDOT that are so incredibly important. That's another way that you can support. And then Kelly mentioned that, I don't know if I'm saying things that Kelly maybe can't say, but the Amtrak soft mock-up that we both overlapped at in Philly last week. One thing that we work with Amtrak quite a bit, and there are lots of folks there that try working so hard to make things better, but 32 years later, everything should really be accessible at this point. One thing that we're really concerned about the intercity train set, which is what we toured the mock-up last week, was that they're proposing to make the aisles narrower, so that a wheelchair user wouldn't be able to get from one end of the train to the one end of a car to the other. So, and for some advocates, that's a real huge issue, and we're pretty pissed off about it. So what we need is people on the outside to raise that concern, because it's legal for them to do it. And they have lots of ways that they're saying, well, we're going to do these workarounds and still make sure that people can get to the cafe car and sit in for the same price in the business class and all of these things, but it feels like a giant step backwards. And then everything that Kelly said about infrastructure and money and just raising that. In addition, when you resurface a road, it can trigger ADA requirements for accessible sidewalks, curb ramps, all of that. That's something that cities are not going to want to do, and we really need. And that's huge, and like that will stand up in court. So them not complying with that. So we need your help. But mostly just everything that Kelly said, do what Kelly says. Like help Kelly get the word out and make sure everybody at DOT and all, if the folks at DOT and all the various departments, like that they are listening and not siloing disability. Those are the biggest things. And thank you, everybody.
Carol, I will, again, we're going to, I know we've chatted with you, and Jan is working with you and getting a date set up for a dedicated discussion. But please, and I'm sure Kelly would support this, please don't be afraid to keep us on track, remind us of what's needed, and help educate us. I will say at the onset of the discussion on this topic, some of us that are not part of the disabled community feel a little uncomfortable talking about it, and we needed to get past that and just embrace it, understand it, and start advocating and becoming a real ally for it. And so please, if you can help us with that, that would be much appreciated. I have one quick question, and then I'm going to, Jonathan, I'm going to call on you next, so give you a warning. Can either of you tell me what is the definition of a person with a disability, at least maybe by USDOT standards?
So I think that I'll weigh in and I'll let Carol add to if she feels like she needs to. But first, I just need to say ditto to Carol. I mean, Carol is my go-to person now. I mean, if I have a transportation question, I go to Carol. So just saying. The other thing is, she's right about the Air Carrier Access Act amendments. And particularly there's an amendment to give people the private right of action to sue airlines. That would really make a big difference. Like if they had to pay when they injure somebody, that would make it, because right now they don't have to. Like you can't really file a suit against them, any disability related suit, because there's no private right of action under their Carrier Access Act. So that would make a big difference. And then I think the definition of disability that's generally applied is the one in the ADA, which really says that if you have a physical or mental impairment which inhibits a life activity, or you have a record of a disability that inhibits a life activity. That's the sort of the definition that we look at.
I know we're bumping up on our end of our time here. We want to respect everyone's time. Jonathan, you posed a question here regarding some legislation enforcement. Do you mind posing that question?
Yeah, so I basically, as I've had 19 years of design experience before, as a engineer in the department, and one of the things that we had always kept our eye on was the proposed public rights of way accessibility guidelines. There's PROAG, as everybody kind of refers to it. That was something. So I guess, is that what you were referring to as becoming finally mandated this year?
Right.
Great.
Yeah, PROAG, which is, it's the public rights of way. I mean, that's where the PROAG comes from, but
yep,
it's the public rights of way accessibility guidelines. Yeah. So
yeah, so we're looking, so that's finally going to become final this year, after
finally,
I think
yes.
2011 was when it was kind of put in its final guideline stage, and then we've kind of been waiting. Agencies, I know, my state in particular have been looking at it and have been trying to follow things of it, because everybody kind of knew it was eventually going to be mandated. It was just a matter of when. But of course, just like any other state agency, there's a transition plan and all that in place. I know that that my state is trying to comply with that. Yeah, that was interesting. That I'm glad to hear that it's finally coming to fruition. And I think that was.
Yeah, it's in its very final stages, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I mean, DOT has weighed in, DOJ's weighed in. I think there's still some final touches being put on it, but and you're right. And the way you put that was much better than the way I put it. But, there has been some adherence to the guidelines because people knew that they would become final at some point, but they haven't been the law of the land. And so there's been that stuff that has not been built according to the guidelines. And so, and there's been some ambiguity about what the guidelines actually would be when they finally come out. So that's really going to come to an end finally. So
yeah, that's great to hear.
Guidelines in place. Yep.
Yeah, and then of course we've got the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has money to now do. So now states have kind of always given the excuse of we don't have the money to do that. So and now there's money available to specifically do that. So I think that will be quite helpful in that regard. But the second question I had was essentially, what is, now that this is going to become final, what is USDOT going to do to kind of enforce this, or what role does USDOT play in enforcement of those guidelines?
Well, the money comes from us. So that's where we'll enforce it.
So essentially, if it wasn't, so it's going to be essentially like if a state or entity weren't to follow the guidelines, then potentially the money would be considered what's called non-participating, where federal money wouldn't be part of a project potentially if the state didn't comply. Yeah,
the requirements are going to be clear within the NOFA, which is Notice of Financial Opportunity. That it's going to be in there. It will be in the technical assistance guidance on when people submit their grants or their applications for the funding. It will be in the formula funding that goes out to the states automatically through the formulas. It's going to be required in the contracts that we enter into with the successful applicants when they do apply for funds. Adherence to ADA and 504 will be in those contracts. I mean, so, and then there will be periodic monitoring. But again, this is really where the local folks can be so much more effective than we can be about making sure that they're following the guidelines and the civil rights laws. I mean, but we're going to do our best to make sure that, again, not a dollar is spent on inaccessible infrastructure, but we're going to need the local folks to really help us make that come about.
I'm going to try to get one more question in that I think is an interesting one for you, Kelly. We think of issues on planes and on trains and autonomous vehicles and things like that. Tracy has a really good question. Does the USDOT have any way to help protect the disabled, both ambulatory and wheelchair users, from the rush of foot traffic, the rush hour traffic in public transportation terminals? Is that something that is being discussed?
It has not been discussed, but I know well what you're talking about, and I agree with you. Like I've waited for the metro in DC for several trains because people simply wouldn't let me on. So I know exactly what you're talking about. But no, we haven't been discussing that. That's another really good topic for us to take up. So the accessible ambulances and the foot traffic, about there being some sort of method to the madness, if you will, I think is really a good thing for us to look at as well. And then I also saw in the chat around EV chargers and the accessibility of that. So I want to address that real quickly because the department is issuing guidance around EV chargers, but we can only affect the EV chargers that we fund. Now, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's money in there to stand up 500,000 chargers. So 500,000 chargers across the country, we are going to be paying for. We're going to make sure that those are accessible. There's already accessibility standards that apply, like the interface standards with the machine, the accessible path of travel, accessible parking. All of those things are already required. They're not being adhered to, but they're required. There are some things that we don't have standards for, and we're going to be working on getting those in place. But the Access Board is currently working on putting up what they would call best practice. But like when Tesla is putting up charging stations and other private entities are putting up charging stations, those are the ones that are being built right now that are not accessible. And that is a DOJ responsibility. They are the ones responsible for enforcing ADA.
Yep.
And if they're building inaccessible charging stations that aren't meeting ADA standards, they're in violation of the law, and you should let DOJ know. I've been letting DOJ know. I actually give them a verbal complaint about this. So send in some written complaints to DOJ's disability rights section, because those guys are actually liable under the law. So I just want to make clear, the private ones that are going up right now are not something we can have control over. Only the ones we fund under DOT are the ones we're going to have a control under, or over, I should say.
Well, and I think that Kelly brought up earlier about how folks like us can be advocates in a variety of ways. And this is another way we can advocate. If you are aware of new construction happening in your neighborhood, I happen to live in a place where, fortunately, people see the value in charging stations, and there's charging stations going up at malls or new construction of condominiums and things like that. Even in our high school parking lot, there's charging stations. But as Jan put up in the chat, there's nothing that is ADA compliant. And so now I know what my next call to the mayor's office is going to be about, so that's something that we have to be mindful about, and knowing that a handicapped accessible ADA compliant charging station is going to be different. I'm also well aware that some of these have taken away some of the parking spaces. So it is a big loop of injustice that we need to follow through with. Something that yesterday when Kelly and I were talking, I asked him a question about if I'm not an ADA expert, what do I do? He brought up the National Center for Independent Living where he used to work. And I'm going to put right up in the chat right now a website here about that particular organization, because this directory of where they're located, they have people in-house who are your ADA experts. And if you want to call somebody and say, hey, I'm trying to help out here, what do I do? That might be a good place to start. So it is 8:03, and I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank Kelly, my new friend in the Stetson. Anyone who wears a Stetson is a friend. And I want to thank everyone for being here at this event. Our next Build the Era event will be on May the 23rd on the topic of traffic gardens. This is going to be a fun one. Not that tonight wasn't fun, but this is a little more whimsical and a little more educational. And I'm not sure, but if it's something that kiddos can come to, we will let you know. But this might actually be our first multi-generational Build the Era webinar. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you all. Be safe, be well, and let's just get out there and build the era, shall we? Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.